It's a strange feeling, standing in the middle of a house where everyone once looked down on you, knowing you own every inch of it. The air in that living room was heavy that evening, not because of the summer heat, but because of what I knew and what they didn't. The smell of fried tilapia and overcooked rice lingered in the air, the ceiling fan clicking above our heads like an impatient clock. My husband's mother, Mrs. Rivera, sat across from me with her usual tight smile, her gold bracelet catching the light every time she adjusted her plate. "Thank you for bringing the salad, dear," she said, not looking up, "though next time maybe something more filling." Her laugh was brittle, like glass tapping against stone. The others, her daughters, my sisters-in-law, chuckled under their breath. I smiled, pretending not to notice, cutting into my food as though their words didn't sting the way they always had. For years, I'd sat at this same table, swallowing pride instead of food. They never saw me as one of them. To them, I was the poor girl their son married, the one with second-hand clothes and no family name worth mentioning. But tonight, things were different. See, they didn't know that just 3 weeks before I'd signed a set of papers that changed everything. They didn't know that this house, this grand, two-story monument to their pride, now belonged to me. My name, my signature, my quiet revenge. And the best part, I didn't buy it to throw them out. No, that would have been too easy. I bought it to let them see themselves the same way they'd made me see myself all those years. Small, dependent, unwanted. My husband, Marco, sat beside me, laughing at one of his sister's jokes, completely unaware of the storm sitting next to him. He'd always said I took things too seriously, that I should learn to laugh more. Maybe tonight I would. I traced the edge of my plate, my fingers brushing against the porcelain as I looked around, the framed wedding photos on the wall, the curtains his mother picked out, the old clock his father refused to replace. Every piece of this house had a story, and now every story had a new owner. When dinner ended, Mrs. Rivera stood and said, "You should be grateful, dear. Not everyone gets to live in a house like this." I looked up, smiled softly, and said, "Oh, I am grateful, more than you'll ever know." The words hung in the air like smoke, faint and sweet, but dangerous if you breathed too deeply. That night, as I drove home, I rolled down the window and let the warm air wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt before, not anger, not bitterness, but control. I wasn't the poor girl anymore. And soon enough, they would all find out just how rich silence can be. When I first met Marco, I didn't have much to my name, just a rented room above a bakery and a heart that still believed kindness could change people. He came into my life like a warm light on a cold morning. I still remember the first time we met. It was at the local community center where I worked as a receptionist. He'd come in to fix the printer, muttering to himself under his breath about cheap toner and government budgets. He made me laugh that day, not because his jokes were clever, but because he looked so serious trying to make them. There was something boyish about him, the kind of charm that makes you forget to protect your heart. We married 2 years later in a small church just outside town. I wore a borrowed dress, simple lace, a little loose at the shoulders, and my grandmother's old veil, yellowed at the edges. My parents were gone by then. They'd passed within months of each other, leaving behind the family land and a handful of bittersweet memories. Marco's family came dressed in designer suits and pearls that caught the light like they were trying to blind someone. His mother hugged me with one arm, her other hand clutching her purse like she was afraid I'd steal something. "It's brave of Marco to marry for love," she'd whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Not everyone could make that choice. I smiled then, the same kind of smile you learn to use when you're too polite to fight back. Our first years of marriage were quiet. We lived in a small apartment near the outskirts of town, above a laundromat that never seemed to close. The walls were thin. I used to fall asleep to the rhythm of washing machines and the sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the window, but I loved that little place. It was ours. Marco worked as an engineer for his family's construction business, and I stayed at the community center. Every morning, I'd pack his lunch, rice, eggs, and a little fruit, and hand it to him at the door. He'd kiss my forehead and say, "You spoil me." I didn't mind. It felt good to take care of someone. It felt like belonging. But slowly, his family started weaving their way into our daily life, tiny remarks, small interruptions. Tea first, it was invitations to dinner that didn't feel like invitations. "Come by," his mother would say, "if you're not too busy." Then it became expectations. "Marco, you should come home more often," she'd say over the phone. "It's not healthy to eat cheap food all the time." Cheap, that word followed me everywhere. Every visit turned into a quiet judgment. The way I dressed, the way I spoke, the way I didn't come from money. Once at Sunday lunch, his sister Lena leaned close and whispered, Mom says you're lucky Marco doesn't mind humble women. I laughed softly like it was a joke, but it burned all the way home. Marco never defended me, not once. When I told him how it made me feel, he sighed and said, "That's just how they are, babe, they don't mean it." But they did, every word, every look, every smirk. Still, I stayed quiet. I kept telling myself love is patient, love is understanding, love doesn't keep score. But sometimes, silence keeps count better than words ever could. Our life settled into a pattern. I'd wake up early, make breakfast, then walk to work. In the evenings, I'd stop by the small market on our street. The vendor, old Mr. Ramos, always saved me the freshest tomatoes. "For the kind lady with the patient smile," he'd say. I liked that, being seen as kind, not poor. When Marco's family bought a new house, the big one on Laurel Street, it became their pride and joy. His mother called it the Rivera legacy. She'd host dinners, invite friends, boast about the imported tiles, the Italian sink, the chandelier that could light up heaven itself. And of course, Marco and I were always invited, or rather expected. Those nights felt endless. I'd sit at the long dining table, pretending not to notice the way they watched me when I used the wrong fork, or when I hesitated before taking the last piece of bread. One evening, his father, Mr. Rivera, looked at me and said, "If you want to fit in, you should stop being so quiet. Wealth is loud, my dear, poor people whisper." I smiled even as my throat tightened. "Maybe," I said, "but whispers can carry farther than you think." He didn't understand what I meant, not then, but I did. That night I went home and cried quietly on the couch, the kind of cry that doesn't make sound, just trembling shoulders and the taste of salt on your lips. And in that silence, something began to shift. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like a seed of awareness, a small, buried truth whispering to me that maybe love shouldn't cost your dignity. Maybe being humble didn't mean being stepped on. And maybe, someday, I'd find a way to remind them of that. There's a sound I'll never forget, the sound of the front door closing after Marco left for work each morning. It wasn't loud or harsh, but it always carried a finality, like the world was reminding me of my solitude. After he left, I'd stand there for a moment, listening to the silence settle, the refrigerator's hum, the faint echo of traffic outside, my own heartbeat filling the room. Then I'd breathe, tie my hair back, and start my day. I kept our apartment neat, not because anyone was coming over, but because order made me feel safe. I liked the smell of floor polish, the sunlight on clean tiles. I'd light a candle by the window, one of those cheap lavender ones from the discount shop, and let the scent soften the air. Work at the community center gave me a sense of purpose. The people there didn't care about designer clothes or family legacies. They cared about showing up, about helping. There was this one woman, Alina, who'd come in every Tuesday with her two little boys. Her husband had left and she was trying to start over. She'd always ask me how I kept smiling. I'd tell her, because someone once smiled at me when I didn't think I deserved it. Sometimes I wondered if I still believed that. At home, Marco would talk about his projects, the buildings he helped design, the clients his father praised him for impressing. I'd listen, proud but distant. When he mentioned his family, his eyes would light up. "Dad says I might take over the Laurel Street property management soon," he'd say, not realizing that every mention of that house knotted something inside me. That house had become a symbol, not just of their wealth, but of the line they'd drawn between us and them. Still, I loved Marco. I loved the way he'd hum when he brushed his teeth, the way he'd hold my hand when we crossed the street. I loved that he tried to make life better for us, even when he didn't fully understand the weight I carried from his family's words. But love doesn't erase hurt, it just teaches you how to hide it better. One night I came home from work to find him sitting at the table with his laptop open and bills spread out everywhere. He looked tired, his shirt half untucked. "Everything okay?" I asked. He sighed, "Just the mortgage, utilities, insurance, it's piling up. I might ask Dad for a short loan." My heart sank. "Marco, maybe we can manage. I can take extra shifts." He shook his head. "No, no, you already do enough. Dad won't mind. He helps us because he can." I wanted to tell him how much I hated that, how every time we took his family's help, it gave them another reason to look down on me. But instead, I just nodded. When you love someone, you learn which truths to swallow. The next Sunday, his mother invited us for brunch at Laurel Street. The invitation came wrapped in guilt as usual. "Marco, you never visit anymore," she'd said over the phone. "Bring your wife. I made her favorite dish. What was it again? Ah yes, adobo, though of course she might prefer her simpler tastes." Even over the phone, I could hear the smile behind her words. I went anyway, I always did. The table was already set when we arrived, polished silverware, linen napkins folded into perfect triangles. His sisters were there, their husbands too. They talked about vacations, business, new cars. I sat quietly, sipping my juice, pretending not to notice how the conversation shifted whenever I spoke. At one point, Lena turned to me and said, "So, have you thought about going back to school? Maybe getting a degree in business, to level up a bit?" Her tone was honeyed, but her eyes weren't. I smiled. I think helping people is my kind of business. She blinked, then looked away, murmuring something about noble but unrealistic dreams. That day, as we were leaving, Mrs. Rivera pulled me aside. Her perfume was heavy, the kind that fills your nose and your thoughts. "You know, dear," she said softly, "I worry about you sometimes. This family has a reputation, we live a certain way, I just don't want Marco to feel held back." I looked her in the eyes steady, "And what about me?" She smiled thinly. "Oh, you're lucky to have him, that's enough, isn't it?" It should have been, but somehow it was. That night, lying beside Marco, I stared at the ceiling, replaying her words. Lucky to have him. I realized she didn't say he was lucky to have me. It hit me then how small they'd made me feel without ever raising their voices, how they'd wrapped their insults in silk and called it family. But I also remembered something my grandmother used to say: the earth doesn't shout when it grows things, but someday it feeds the ones who mocked it. I didn't know then how much those words would shape what came next. All I knew was that something inside me had started to wake up, quiet but certain, like roots breaking through soil. And though I didn't know it yet, the land my grandparents left me, that patch of earth everyone had forgotten, would become the key to everything. I think it began with the way Marco started talking about the family business. At first it was casual, just updates from his father, small mentions over dinner, but soon his tone changed. He talked about opportunities, image, and responsibility, words that sounded polished but heavy with expectation. We'd be sitting at our small kitchen table, the one with a crack down the middle, and he'd be scrolling through his phone. "Dad says we might open new offices near Laurel Street," he'd say. "It could be good for us, maybe even move closer to them." Move closer. I smiled faintly, stirring my coffee. "We're close enough already." He laughed, thinking I was joking. But I was. Something had begun to shift in Marco, not in how he treated me exactly, but in what he noticed. He'd start commenting on things he never used to care about: my clothes, the way I presented myself, the kind of bag I carried to work. "You're beautiful," he'd say, "but maybe you should start dressing a bit more put together, like Mom and Lena." I'd nod, smile, and turn away before he could see the hurt on my face. I couldn't help but notice it wasn't just him. His family had grown bolder too, the subtle digs becoming open remarks. One afternoon, we were at their house for a barbecue. The air smelled like smoke and rosemary, the kind of scent that makes you nostalgic for something you never had. Everyone was gathered around the patio, glasses of wine in hand, talking about vacations and stocks. Mrs. Rivera was showing off her garden, rows of imported orchids that needed more attention than most children. She turned to me suddenly and said, "Maybe you could start something like this at your place, dear, though I suppose the air near your side of town isn't quite right for orchids." Laughter followed. Just a polite, social kind of laughter, but it stung like a slap. I excused myself, pretending to take a call, and stood by the fence for a long time. From there, I could see their world so clearly. The laughter, the gold bracelets, the sense of belonging I could never buy, no matter how kind or quiet I was. That's when I started noticing things, little details I'd overlooked before. Like how Marco always seemed to go silent when money came up in and Versitian, how his mother would send him messages late at night, urgent family matters. How his father had once jokingly said, "We're investing a lot in Marco's future. Hopefully his wife doesn't drag him down." It wasn't just words anymore, it was something deeper, an unspoken plan. One evening, I overheard Marco on the phone in the living room. He didn't know I was awake. His voice was low, calm, but different, rehearsed. "Yes, Dad," he said. "I know, I'll talk to her. She doesn't need to worry about the details." I sat in the dark, my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. "What details?" The next morning, I asked him about it casually. "You were talking to your dad late last night. Everything okay?" He looked surprised, then smiled too quickly. "Oh yeah, just business stuff, nothing serious." But I saw it, the flicker of hesitation. That was the first clue. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was a Friday night, one of those humid evenings where the air feels too thick to breathe. Mrs. Rivera had invited us to a small family gathering, which, in her language, meant a formal dinner with at least 12 people and 3 courses. The table was long, draped in white, crystal glasses, silver spoons, everything gleaming under warm light. I sat beside Marco, trying to blend into the wallpaper. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Rivera leaned forward, her tone light but deliberate. "So, Marco," she said, "your father and I were talking. We think it's time you took on more responsibility, maybe even managed some of the family assets." Marco smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. "That'd be great. And of course," she added, glancing at me, "we'd want to make sure everything aligns with the family's image. You understand, right, dear?" I nodded, unsure what she meant. Lena giggled. "Mom just means it's good to have a certain presentation, for events, social circles, maybe even in business." They laughed again. I smiled faintly, but something about the way she looked at me made my skin prickle. Later that night when we got home, I asked Marco what they meant by family assets. He hesitated. "It's complicated, just some property things." "Property things like what?" He ran a hand through his hair. "Like the Laurel Street house. Dad's thinking of transferring it under my name someday. It's part of the plan." The room went still. "Under his name." "Not their name, not our name, his." I swallowed. "And what does that mean for us?" He smiled too easily. "It means stability, babe. It means we're part of something bigger." But deep down, I knew it meant they would always hold the key. That night after he fell asleep, I sat by the window and looked out at the faint city lights. My reflection stared back at me, small, tired, but quietly alive. And then I remembered the envelope my grandmother had left me years ago, the one with the deed to that forgotten land, the one I'd tucked away in a box under the bed. At the time, it felt like a memory, sentimental, but not much else. But that night, it began to feel like something else. A possibility. A whisper of independence I hadn't heard in years. And though I didn't realize it yet, that whisper was about to become the loudest thing in my life. A few weeks after that dinner, I began to notice how invisible I'd become in my own marriage. It started small, like everything does. Marco would mention his plans with his family without including me. "Mom wants me to come by for a quick lunch," or "Dad needs help with paperwork this weekend." Sometimes he'd say it as he put on his shoes, already halfway out the door. At first, I didn't mind. I told myself he was just busy. But then the invitations stopped altogether. The family dinners that once included me now happened without my knowing. I'd see photos on social media, smiling faces, wine glasses, Mrs. Rivera at the center of it all, and I'd feel that old ache settle deep inside. When I asked Marco about it, he'd shrug. "Oh, it was just a quick thing. You wouldn't have liked it anyway." That line, "you wouldn't have liked it anyway," became his favorite excuse. And maybe he was right. I probably wouldn't have liked watching them toast to each other's success, while ignoring the woman who loved him before success was even on the table. But still, I wanted to be included, to belong. One night I came home from work to find Marco at the kitchen table again, papers spread everywhere. But this time they weren't bills, they were property plans. I saw the words Rivera Holdings at the top and beneath it, Laurel Street Development. I asked, "What's this?" He glanced up startled. "Oh, just something Dad asked me to review, boring stuff." He started to gather them quickly, but one sheet slipped out and fluttered to the floor near my feet. I bent to pick it up. It wasn't boring. It was a blueprint, a renovation plan, for the Laurel Street property, the family home. At the bottom of the page, I saw a note in Mr. Rivera's handwriting. Insure title under Marco's name, not joint. For a second, my breath caught. Not joint. Marco's smile faltered when he saw me reading. He reached for the page. "Hey, don't worry about that, okay? It's just legal wording. Dad's old-fashioned." Old-fashioned. That's what they called it when they erased women from family property, when they said love was partnership but meant ownership. I didn't argue, I simply handed him the paper and said, "Of course, legal wording." But inside me, something cold began to bloom, quiet, deliberate, patient. That night I opened the box beneath the bed, the one with my grandmother's things. The scent of old paper filled the air, soft and dry. Inside was the deed. I hadn't looked at it in years. 7.3 hectares. A stretch of farmland near the highway, once worthless, now likely surrounded by new developments. I ran my fingers over my grandmother's handwriting on the note she'd tucked inside. For my granddaughter who will one day know her worth. I closed the box, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I'd do yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange kind of safety, the kind that comes from knowing you have something they can't take from you. The next weekend, Marco asked me to join him for lunch with his family again. I almost said no, but something inside me said to go, to watch, to listen. When we arrived, the house was louder than usual, people bustling in and out, workers carrying rolls of fabric, paint cans stacked in the corner. Renovations had already started. Mrs. Rivera saw me and smiled that polished smile. "Oh, you made it. I thought you'd be too busy." "Busy with what?" I asked softly. She tilted her head. "You work, don't you? I'm sure your schedule's full." It wasn't the words, it was the way she said you work, as though it were a flaw, a hobby, not a necessity. Her bracelets jingled as she reached for Marco's arm. "I'm just so proud of my son. He's finally taking charge. The house will be his soon." She looked at me then, her eyes sharp and curious. "You must be proud too." "I am," I said quietly, "very." Lena's voice came from across the room. "Oh, Mama, you should show her the new blueprints, for the Rivera residence sign out front." Everyone laughed. I smiled, but my hands had gone cold. That night I asked Marco, "So the house is officially yours now?" He nodded, almost. "The papers are being processed. Dad said we can move in after the renovation's done." "Move in?" I asked, "all of us?" He hesitated. "Well, yes, I mean for now, everyone's staying there while it's fixed up. But eventually, yeah, it'll be ours." Eventually. Such a soft word to cover so much distance. I didn't say anything more, but in the quiet that followed, I thought about how life has a way of turning circles, and how sometimes you have to let people build their own walls before you decide who gets to live inside them. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. A man came to the community center, a real estate agent. He was there to post flyers about new development projects near the highway. When he showed me the brochure, my eyes froze. There it was, my grandparents' land. The surrounding area had boomed. Prices had tripled in the last 2 years. "Developers are desperate to buy," he said. "If you know anyone who owns property there, tell them to hold out. The offers are only going to rise." I smiled faintly. I might know someone. That night I sat alone at the kitchen table, the deed spread before me under the warm yellow light. I traced my grandmother's name, then mine beneath it. They'd spent years reminding me I came from nothing. But the truth was, I came from something deeper. Not money, not reputation, but legacy. Rooted, quiet, patient, like the earth itself. And while they were busy measuring their worth in chandeliers and square footage, I was holding the kind of wealth they'd never understand. Not yet. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive like thunder. It comes softly in small silences, in the way someone avoids your eyes when they speak. The first time I felt it, it was a Wednesday night. I'd just come home from work, my uniform still faintly smelling of detergent and paper, the scent of the community center. Marco wasn't home yet. His shoes were gone, his jacket missing. I thought he was just late. I made dinner: rice, adobo, a little side of sautéed vegetables, the kind of meal that says I still care. By 8 he still wasn't home. By 9 I texted, no reply. At 10 I sat at the kitchen table watching the clock tick. Outside, the city was hushed, that hour when even the street dogs quiet down. I tried reading, cleaning, anything to distract myself. When the door finally opened, he stepped in smelling faintly of wine and perfume, a floral scent I didn't own. I didn't say a word. He noticed the untouched plates on the table. "Oh, I should have called. Sorry, M. And Dad wanted me to meet with a potential investor tonight. It ran late." "An investor?" I asked. "Yeah, for the Laurel Street property. Big plans, you know how Dad is." He was smiling, easy, careless, but something in his tone felt practiced. I nodded, pretending to believe him, but as he turned away, his phone lit up on the counter. A message flashed across the screen. "Lena Rivera," she believed it. "You're too good," Kuya face with tears of joy. I didn't touch the phone. I just stared at it, the way you stare at a snake you've just realized was in your house all along. He caught me looking, his face changed instantly from calm to defensive. It's not what it looks like. Then what is it? I asked quietly. She's joking, you know how Lena is, she's teasing. Teasing about what? About lying to me. He rubbed his forehead, sighing like I was the unreasonable one. Can we not do this now? It's been a long day. He walked away before I could answer. And just like that, the air between us shifted. It was subtle like a thread snapping soundlessly. After that night, things felt different. He stopped talking about plans. He came home later. His phone was always face down. He said it was stress, that his father was pressuring him. But the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore if I was part of his future or just a shadow in his way. Then one afternoon, the truth found me. I was leaving work when I saw Mrs. Rivera's car parked outside. At first, I thought she was there to visit someone, but when she waved me over, smiling like always, I knew better. Going home, she asked. Oh, yes, ma'am. Perfect, let's talk while I drive you. I hesitated but got in. Her perfume filled the car, strong and sweet. She always wore too much. For a while, she just talked about the renovation, about Marco's bright future, about how proud she was of him. Then casually she said, "We're almost done with the paperwork for the transfer." "The Laurel Street property?" I asked. She smiled. "Yes, it'll all be under Marco's name soon. His father insisted, you know, to keep the property in the family." I looked at her. "In the family?" She nodded. "Of course, that's how we do things." Her tone was soft, but the message was sharp. "You are not family." Then, as if she hadn't said enough, she added, "Don't take this the wrong way, dear, but maybe it's best if you start preparing for when Marco gets busier. He'll be handling more responsibilities, meetings, travel, investors. You'll need to adjust." "I'll adjust." She smiled kindly. "To your place, to your role, every family has its way of keeping balance, and you've been good so far." "So far?" I stared out the window, my reflection pale against the glass. I realized then that her kindness was never kindness. It was control. When she dropped me off, I thanked her because that's what you do when you've been raised to be polite, even to those who hurt you. But inside, something broke. That night when Marco got home, I asked him directly, "Did you transfer the Laurel Street house?" He froze. "What?" "Your mother said the paperwork's almost done." He hesitated. "It's not like that, babe, it's just a formality." "A formality that doesn't include me." He sighed, frustrated. "You don't understand how this works, it's business." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized I didn't recognize the man in front of me. "When did I stop being your partner and become a formality?" He didn't answer. And that silence, heavier than any lie, was my answer. I didn't cry that night, I didn't yell. I just sat in the dark and thought about my grandmother's land, the one thing in this world that had my name and mine alone. They could take everything else, my pride, my place at their table, but not that. Not what she left me. Not what I could still make of it. So I called the real estate agent the next morning. When he answered, I said, "I have property on the highway. I want to know what it's worth." He paused. "You're in luck, ma'am. Developers are offering above market value right now." "How much above?" When he told me the number, I had to sit down. It was more money than Marco's family had ever hinted at, more than enough to buy 10 Laurel Street houses, or one very specific one. And that's when I decided. I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't fight. I'd do what they'd never expect from a woman they called poor. I'd be patient. I'd smile. And I'd wait for the right moment to make them see who they'd been mocking all along. Because revenge, I realized, didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it sounds like the quiet rustle of paper, the signing of a deed. The morning after I called the agent, I woke before sunrise. The world outside was still gray, the city barely stirring. I sat by the window, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the light creep across our kitchen wall, the same wall where I'd once pinned our wedding photo. In that picture, Marco was smiling and I looked hopeful. That was the word, hopeful. But age. Hope has a quiet way of eroding, doesn't it? Not all at once, but grain by grain, until one day you wake up and realize you've been building your future on sand. By the time Marco came downstairs, I had already washed the dishes, folded the laundry, and put on my calmest face. He barely looked at me, just kissed my forehead absently and said, "I might be home late again." I nodded. "Family business." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. Yeah, something like that. When the door shut behind him, I took out my grandmother's deed again, laid it on the table, and dialed the agent back. I'm ready to sell, I said. By the end of that week, we were deep in negotiations. He called me every day with updates, offers climbing higher and higher as the developers competed. It was surreal. Numbers I'd never imagined were suddenly real, attached to my name. At work, I told no one. At home, I pretended everything was normal. Marco still came and went at odd hours, still talked vaguely about meetings and plans. His phone was always nearby, always face down. One night, curiosity, or maybe pain, got the better of me. He was in the shower when his phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Lena, Mom said you can finalize without her signature. She doesn't need to know, we'll take care of it. My throat went dry. Without her signature. My signature. When he stepped out, I was sitting at the edge of the bed, the phone in my hands. Marco, I said quietly, what are you finalizing? He froze, towel in hand. What? Your sister texted, something about my signature not being needed. He blinked, caught off guard, then scowled. You shouldn't go through my phone. You shouldn't lie to your wife. His eyes narrowed. It's not lying if it's family business. Family, I repeated softly. I see. He sighed heavily, dropping the towel onto the chair. You're making this harder than it needs to be. You know how my parents are, I just want to keep the peace. By signing away everything without me. He looked frustrated, cornered. It's just a house, for God's sake, you act like it's some kind of betrayal. It's not about the house, I said. It's about what it means, about how easily you erase me when they tell you to. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned away, muttering, you wouldn't understand. And that was when I realized something I'd never wanted to admit. He didn't see me as his equal. He saw me as a kindness he'd extended, a charity maybe, something to protect, but never to trust with real power. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I just nodded. Okay, I said softly, I understand now. The next morning, I met with the agent in person. We finalized the sale within days. When I saw the final number on the check, my breath hitched. It was enough to buy freedom, enough to buy silence, enough to buy the house that had once made me feel small. But I wasn't ready, not yet. Patience had been my armor all these years. I wasn't about to take it off now. So I waited. A few weeks passed. Marco's family finished their renovations. There was a celebration dinner, of course there was. The Riveras never missed a chance to celebrate themselves. They called it a blessing. A priest came, neighbors attended, and I was invited as an afterthought naturally. When I arrived, the house looked almost unrecognizable. New floors, fresh paint, a chandelier that looked like a cascade of glass raindrops, the kind of beauty that impresses but never comforts. Mrs. Rivera greeted me at the door, eyes scanning my outfit like a price tag. You made it, she said, as if surprised. Of course, I replied. I wouldn't miss such an important day. Inside, laughter filled the air. The dining table gleamed under soft lighting. Marco stood with his father discussing future expansions. Lena and her husband posed for photos. Everyone looked perfectly content, perfectly fake. Midway through the meal, Mrs. Rivera raised her glass. To family, she said, to the next generation and to keeping our legacy strong. Glasses clinked, smiles all around. I lifted mine too. To legacies, I said quietly, may we all know who really owns them. She didn't catch the tone, but Marco did. His eyes flickered toward me uneasy. Later that night, after everyone had left, I lingered behind, helping clean the dishes. Mrs. Rivera joined me in the kitchen, humming softly. You know, she said, you've turned out to be quite the quiet little supporter. Not every wife knows her place so gracefully. I looked at her, then smiled, gentle, deliberate. I've always believed people should know their place, yes. She laughed, mistaking it for agreement. But inside, I was already thinking about the papers I'd signed, the sale, the transfer, the way I'd quietly instructed my agent to contact the Riveras, property manager under a separate name. Because while they'd been busy playing pretend with their legacy, I'd already placed an offer on the Laurel Street house, through a company name they didn't recognize. My offer was higher than the appraised value, generous, immediate. And when the bank papers cleared, that house, their house, was no longer under Marco's name. It was under mine. I remember holding the final document in my hands, my name typed neatly across the top, stamped and notarized. It felt like justice printed on paper. Not revenge, not triumph. Just peace, the kind that comes from finally owning the ground they made you kneel on. But I didn't tell them, not yet. I waited because sometimes silence is the sweetest echo of all. And I wanted them to hear it, the sound of their own arrogance returning home. The day I became the owner of the Rivera house was strangely ordinary. No fanfare, no trumpets, just the low hum of the city and a stack of papers on a lawyer's desk. When I signed the last page, the lawyer smiled politely. "Congratulations, Mrs. Rivera," he paused when he saw my expression. "I suppose," I said softly, "it's just Ms. now." He nodded. "Regardless, it's all under your name." My name. The same one they used to whisper behind closed doors, that poor girl, that charity case. Now printed in bold letters across the title deed of their beloved home. I thanked him, folded the papers neatly into my bag, and stepped outside. The air felt different, lighter. I could almost taste the quiet sweetness of it, freedom mixed with a hint of disbelief. For the next few days, I went about my life as though nothing had changed. At work, I smiled at the children running through the community center halls. I helped organize the senior wellness drive, filled forms, answered phones. I was calm, predictable, unremarkable. But inside, something had shifted. Every time Marco's name appeared on my phone, I no longer felt the familiar ache, only a faint, distant echo of what used to be. He still sent the occasional text, polite, detached updates. "Dinner at Mom's tonight. They asked if you're coming Sunday." I always replied with the same line. "I'll think about it." And I always did. I thought about it while I walked home under the dim glow of streetlights. I thought about it while I boiled rice or folded laundry. I thought about what it meant to belong and how easy it was to mistake endurance for love. One evening, my agent called. "The previous owner's family seems confused," he said, his tone cautious. "They were under the impression that it was being transferred within their circle. They're asking who the new buyer is." "Did you tell them?" I asked. "Of course not. The documents list your trust name, not your personal one." I smiled faintly. "Good, let's keep it that way for now." That night, I sat by my small kitchen table, the one Marco never liked because it wobbled slightly, and opened the deed again. It still didn't feel real. I thought about my grandmother, about the way she used to walk her land barefoot, letting the soil stain her feet. She used to say, "If you love the earth, it will remember you." Maybe that's why things turned out the way they did. Maybe the earth had finally remembered me. Days passed quietly until one Thursday evening, Marco called unexpectedly. "Mom's hosting a dinner," he said. "For the renovation's completion, she insists you come this time." I hesitated. "She insists." He sighed. "Look, it's just dinner. Let's not make it a thing." I could hear the weariness in his voice, the exhaustion that comes from living between loyalty and guilt, but I didn't pity him, not anymore. "Fine," I said softly, "I'll be there." When I arrived, the house looked perfect, polished floors, manicured lawn, warm lights spilling from the windows, but it wasn't theirs anymore. Not really. That secret pulsed beneath my calm smile like a hidden heartbeat. Mrs. Rivera greeted me at the door. "You're early," she said, surprised. "How lovely." I handed her a small basket of fruit, a polite gesture, nothing more. Inside, the family was already gathered. They'd set the long table again, the silver gleaming, the air scented with roast chicken and perfume. I took my usual seat, the one slightly to the side, where I could see everyone but rarely be seen myself. Dinner began as always, laughter, gossip, self-praise disguised as conversation. Marco talked about business, his father bragged about the family name, Lena complained about her housekeeper. Everything was exactly the same. Except me. I was listening differently now, not as someone hoping to be accepted, but as someone who no longer needed to be. Halfway through, Mrs. Rivera began one of her speeches. "You know," she said, swirling her wine, "this house holds so many memories. Your father and I built it with love, and now Marco will carry it forward. It's our legacy." She looked at me then, eyes glinting. "We've been so blessed, haven't we? Not everyone can live surrounded by such beauty." I smiled gently. Yes, you're right, it's rare. The table fell quiet for a moment. Maybe it was the tone of my voice, even measured, but with something underneath it. Lena cleared her throat, breaking the silence. Well, it's ours now, so we'll make it even better. I set down my fork slowly. Ours. Lena blinked, caught off guard. Of course, the Riveras. I nodded. Funny how things change. Mrs. Rivera frowned. What do you mean? I met her gaze, calm, unblinking. Just that legacies can shift hands quietly, sometimes without anyone realizing. She gave a tight laugh. You speak in riddles, dear. Have you been reading too many dramas? I smiled again, softer this time. Maybe. Marco watched me from across the table, unease flickering in his eyes. He sensed something, but he didn't know what, not yet. I didn't push further, not that night. The moment wasn't ripe. Instead, I stayed until dessert, then excused myself early, citing work the next morning. Mrs. Rivera gave me her usual half embrace, polite, perfumed, hollow. When I walked out into the night, the air was thick with the scent of rain. I paused at the end of their driveway, my driveway, and looked back. Through the lit windows, I could see them laughing, drinking, completely unaware. It struck me then how little people see when they're blinded by pride. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt peaceful, detached, like I'd finally stepped outside a story that never belonged to me. But peace doesn't mean the end. Because justice, quiet, steady justice, still needed to be revealed. And when that moment came, I wanted it to be gentle, undeniable, and complete. Not to destroy them, just to remind them that the woman they mocked for having nothing now held the deed to everything they valued. The weekend after that dinner, I woke early. The sun was only just rising, spilling soft orange light through the thin curtains of my apartment. The streets outside were quiet except for the distant whine of a tricycle and the soft barking of dogs somewhere down the alley. I made coffee, strong, black, and sat at the table with my notebook open. For the first time in years, my mind was clear. No questions, no doubts, just plans. I wasn't after revenge. I didn't want to hurt Marco or his family. What I wanted was balance, a quiet shift of power back into my hands. So I began to write notes, dates, numbers. What I owned, what I owed. What they thought they owned, and what they didn't anymore. I had the house deed, of course, but I also had every conversation, every paper trail, every legal record confirming that the Laurel Street property had been sold, cleanly, properly, beyond contest. They couldn't undo it even if they tried. By Monday, I called my lawyer to arrange the final stage, the public registration transfer. It would be processed through the city's property office that Friday. After that, the truth wouldn't be a secret anymore. But I didn't want to tell them myself. I wanted them to discover it, naturally, painfully, and perfectly. That Thursday evening, Marco called again. He sounded tired. Mom's been asking about you. She says you've been distant. I smiled faintly. Have I? You know how she gets, he sighed. Just come by this weekend. It'll make things easier. All right, I said. Saturday then. When Saturday came, the air felt strange, heavy, like the sky was holding its breath. I took my time getting ready, wore a simple white blouse, dark jeans, small earrings, no makeup, just calm. As I drove toward Laurel Street, I passed the property office, the very same one that had finalized my registration the day before. The deed was now fully active, publicly recorded. My name, plain as day, listed as the legal owner. I smiled to myself. When I arrived, the Rivera's house, my house, looked as immaculate as ever. A car was parked out front. Marco's father was in the garden, talking to a man in a suit, their real estate broker, I guessed. He didn't see me at first, but when he did, he straightened and called out, "Ah, you're here. Marco's inside." I nodded politely, "Good morning, sir." Inside, the family was gathered in the living room, mid-conversation. They went quiet when I entered. Mrs. Rivera's smile was polite, but her eyes were sharp. "You came," she said. "How thoughtful." "I wouldn't miss it," I said softly. Marco looked uneasy, though I couldn't tell why. "We were just discussing some paperwork," he said. "Dad's been talking with our broker about the property management. You know, setting things up under my name." I tilted my head. "Under your name?" He nodded confidently this time. "Yeah, finalizing everything, it's a formality." Mrs. Rivera chimed in proudly. "Yes, the family's finally taking control of its assets properly. We've had this house for generations. It's important to keep it in the Rivera bloodline. I smiled gently. That's wonderful. Of course, she added, her tone soft but pointed, not every one gets to call this place home. I met her gaze, steady and calm. You're right about that. She frowned, unsure whether I was agreeing or correcting her. Marco's father walked in then, holding a folder of documents. All right, he said, let's sign these and get this house secured once and for all. He spread the papers across the table. The realtor stood nearby, polite and efficient. I watched quietly as Marco leaned forward to sign, until the agent cleared his throat awkwardly. Mr. Rivera, there seems to be a discrepancy, the man said. Mr. Rivera frowned. What kind of discrepancy? The agent looked uncomfortable. According to the registry, the current legal owner isn't listed as you. The system shows a different name. Silence fell. Mrs. Rivera blinked. What do you mean? This house has been in our family for decades. Yes, ma'am, the agent said gently, but the recent transaction record shows the property was sold 6 weeks ago. The title is under new ownership. Marco straightened, confusion clouding his face. That's not possible. Sold to who? The agent hesitated, glancing around the room. To a Ms. Selena Ramirez. For a moment the name didn't register, then it hit them all at once. Mrs. Rivera's face went pale. Lena gasped softly. Marco froze, eyes widening, his mouth half open. Mr. Rivera was the first to speak. That's a mistake. He turned to me. You wouldn't happen to know. But he stopped mid-sentence. Because I was smiling. A small, calm smile, the kind you wear when the storm has already passed. I folded my hands neatly on my lap and said, no mistake, Mr. Rivera. Miss Selena Ramirez is me. The room went still. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the tick of the clock on the wall, the distant sound of a car passing outside. Every sound felt sharp, alive. Mrs. Rivera was the first to find her voice. You bought this house. Yes, I said softly, from the same agent your family used for the transfer. Marco's voice was barely a whisper. Why would you? I looked at him, at the man who once made me laugh in a small community office, who promised me love and partnership, and who, somewhere along the way, let pride take his place. Because I could, I said, and because you all made me forget that for a while. Mrs. Rivera's lips trembled. This is humiliating. No, I said gently, it's honest. Sometimes truth feels like humiliation because we mistake pride for worth. No one spoke after that. I stood, smoothed my blouse, and added quietly, don't worry. You can stay here for now. I won't throw anyone out. I just thought you should know whose name is on the door you're so proud of. Then I walked out slowly without looking back. Outside, the air was still heavy, but I felt light. I stood by the gate for a long time, watching the wind stir the leaves. The house behind me glowed under the late afternoon sun, its windows reflecting gold. I didn't hate them. I didn't even pity them. I simply understood that sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It signs papers quietly. It smiles at the right time. It lets the truth do all the talking. And that day, the truth spoke louder than any revenge ever could. The news traveled faster than I expected. By the following Monday, everyone in the neighborhood seemed to know. Laurel Street was its own little world, and in that world, the Riveras were royalty. So when the story began to circulate that their family home had been quietly bought out, whispers bloomed like weeds through the community. Did you hear? The Rivera property sold. To whom? No one knows, but I heard it's someone close. The gossip didn't take long to reach Mrs. Rivera's friends, the ones she used to invite over for tea just to show off her furniture. They stopped coming, some out of curiosity, some out of quiet schadenfreude. At first, I tried to stay away from it all. I still went to work, still smiled at the children in the community center, still bought tomatoes from old Mr. Ramos on the way home. But people started looking at me differently, not with pity anymore, but with something else. Respect, maybe, or confusion, maybe both. Mr. Ramos, for one, grinned at me one morning as he packed my vegetables. Miss Selena, he said, his voice low and teasing, I heard something about a certain house on Laurel Street. I smiled, pretending not to know. Oh. He chuckled, if it's true, then good. The soil always remembers who treats it kindly. His words warmed me more than I expected. Still, I didn't want to feed the gossip. I kept my quiet life, let the truth work on its own. But truth has a way of revealing itself, especially when pride is involved. That Friday, I received a message from Marco. He asked to meet alone. We met at a small cafe downtown, one we used to visit when we were newly married. The same chipped tables, the same bitter coffee. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, tired. Unshaven, the light in his eyes dimmed. He sat down without speaking. For a long moment, the only sound was the clatter of spoons and the low hum of conversation around us. Finally, he said, "They're humiliated." I nodded, "I know. Mom hasn't left the house in days, Dad's furious. Lena's crying every time someone mentions your name." I didn't intend to humiliate anyone, I said quietly. I just wanted to remind them of something they forgot. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You've made your point." I didn't have a point to make, Marco. I had a truth to claim. He looked up then, his voice breaking slightly. "You could have told me." I studied him for a moment, the man I once built my life around. "Would you have listened?" He didn't answer, just sat there, eyes clouded with regret. After a while he said, "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," I replied softly, "but sometimes not meaning to doesn't stop the hurt." We sat in silence. The coffee between us had gone cold. When he finally left, I didn't feel angry or relieved, just sat in a quiet, settled way, like watching the end of a long, painful play and knowing every line by heart. That weekend, the Riveras stopped all social gatherings. The grand house, my house, grew quieter, the gates stayed closed, the curtains were drawn. Neighbors began whispering about the fall of pride, about the irony of life. Some pitied them, some didn't. I didn't interfere, I let time do the talking. But word eventually reached the local paper. Not a scandal, not headlines, just a small human interest story about a local property changing hands under unexpected circumstances. The reporter didn't use names, but everyone knew. And somehow that small story did what no argument ever could. It softened things. People started to see the Riveras differently, not as untouchable but as human. Even Mrs. Rivera, I heard, stopped correcting people when they addressed her less formally. She even went to church again, something she hadn't done in years. Funny, isn't it, how losing something material can sometimes bring back something moral? I didn't take joy in their discomfort. I took peace in the balance of it. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I saw Marco waiting outside. He looked hesitant, holding an envelope in his hand. "This is for you," he said, offering it. Inside was a check for a portion of the family share they'd intended to transfer to him. "It's what's fair," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't change things, but maybe it helps." I looked at him for a long moment. "You don't need to pay me, Marco. I never wanted that." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's just closure." "Maybe," I said. Before he turned to go, he asked softly, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it, about all the dinners, the laughter, the silence, about the years I spent trying to prove I was enough. Then I shook my head. "No, Marco, I don't hate you. I just stopped waiting for you to see me." He looked down, nodded once, and walked away. And just like that, it was done. The story had spread, the balance had shifted, and I didn't need to say another word. Because the truth, once it's free, doesn't need an audience. It just needs to exist. A month passed before I set foot inside the Laurel Street house again. By then, the whispers had settled into silence. The neighborhood had found new stories to gossip about: a councilman's scandal, a wedding that ended before the honeymoon. Life moves on quickly when it's not yours unraveling. But for the Riveras, time seemed to slow. Marco's father had fallen ill shortly after the news broke. Nothing severe, just the kind of sickness that pride tends to invite: headaches, sleeplessness, the weight of a tarnished name. Mrs. Rivera stayed home more often. Her friends still called, but less frequently, their laughter no longer spilling through her open windows. I heard all this from neighbors, not from Marco. We hadn't spoken since the cafe. And yet, one Sunday morning, I found myself walking toward that house again, not out of cruelty or curiosity, but because I'd begun to feel something unexpected: empathy. The gate was half open. The same gate that once seemed to keep me out now swung gently with the wind, creaking like an old secret. Inside, the air smelled of dust and lemon polish. The grand chandelier still glittered, but dimmer somehow, as if even the light was tired. Mrs. Rivera was sitting in the living room, her hands folded on her lap. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair now streaked with silver. When she saw me, her eyes widened then softened. "You came." I nodded. "I wanted to check on you." For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice quieter than I'd ever heard, she said, "We were cruel to you." I didn't answer right away. I just looked around at the furniture she'd polished for years, the framed photos, the echoes of laughter that used to fill this space. "I think," I said slowly, "you were afraid." Her eye flickered. "Afraid of being less than what you pretended to be," I said gently. "Afraid that someone like me could remind you that worth doesn't come from what you own." She stared at me for a long time. Then unexpectedly she smiled, a weary, fragile smile. "You sound like your grandmother," she whispered. The words caught me off guard. "You knew her." "Not personally," she said, "but your husband told us about her once, how she raised you, how she worked the land with her bare hands. I remember thinking that kind of strength isn't for everyone." There was no venom in her voice anymore, just truth. "I didn't mean for things to go this way," she said finally. "We thought we were helping Marco secure his future, we thought." I interrupted softly. "You thought he'd do better without me." Tears welled in her eyes. "Yes." I didn't move toward her, I didn't need to. Because forgiveness isn't always about words or gestures. Sometimes it's just the act of standing in the same room again, breathing the same air as the person who once made you feel invisible. After a long pause, I said, "You don't have to apologize to me. You've already lived your apology." She looked confused. "How so?" "By seeing that power can be taken and given back without a single argument." Her shoulders slumped, she nodded slowly. "I suppose that's true." Before I left, she asked, "Will you sell the house?" I smiled faintly. "Not yet." "Then what will you do with it?" "I'll wait," I said. "Maybe rent it to a family who needs a fresh start. Maybe turn it into something useful." She blinked as if she hadn't considered that possibility. "You'd let strangers live here." I looked around the room one last time, at the chandeliers, the marble floors, the heavy curtains. "It's just a house," I said. "What makes it home are the hearts inside it." And with that, I left her sitting there, quiet, still, thoughtful. Outside, the sky was clear. The air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet. As I walked down the street, I saw neighbors peeking from their porches, curious, cautious smiles on their faces. They didn't say much, but I could feel it, the shift. The poor girl had become the woman who owned what once defined her. But more than that, she had become free. Later that evening, I returned to my small apartment, brewed tea, and sat by the window. The city buzzed softly outside, life going on as it always does. I thought of Marco, I thought of his mother's tired eyes. And I thought of my grandmother, her hands rough with soil, her back bent but never broken. For the first time in a long while, I whispered, "I did it, Lola, I found my worth." And though the room was empty, I felt her there in the stillness, in the faint rustle of the wind against the window pane. Not proud, not triumphant, just peaceful. Because the greatest consequence of truth isn't humiliation. It's transformation. Theirs and mine. It's strange how silence feels different when it isn't filled with fear anymore. For years, silence in my life meant uncertainty, the quiet between Marco's half-truths, between his mother's sharp smiles, between my own heartbeats as I tried to make myself smaller to fit their world. But now, silence feels like rest. I wake before the sun most mornings the same way I always have. I still make coffee, I still light a candle by the window, but the difference is I breathe easier. Sometimes peace isn't something you find. It's something that finds you after you've stopped chasing approval from people who never meant to give it. After the Laurel Street house became mine, I didn't live there right away. I didn't want to. The walls still carried their echoes, their voices. The house was heavy with years of pretense. So I kept my little apartment, the one above the old laundromat. I liked it there, the rhythm of the machines downstairs, the laughter of children in the street, the smell of bread from the bakery across the road. It wasn't luxury, but it was home. And in that simplicity, I found something I'd lost long before money ever entered the picture: joy. Small, quiet joy. The kind you find in morning light on clean floors, or in a neighbor's knock on the door with fresh pandizzle. The kind you can't buy, no matter how many chandeliers you own. A few weeks after my visit to Mrs. Rivera, I decided to put the Laurel Street house to use. I called a local social worker, someone I'd met years ago through the community center, and asked, "Do you know any families who have been displaced recently? Maybe someone who needs temporary housing." She paused, surprised. "You're offering your property?" "Yes," I said, "just until they get back on their feet." Within a week, a young couple moved in, Rosa and Miguel, and their little boy, Tomas. He was 4 with big eyes and a laugh that filled every corner. The first time I visited to hand over the keys, Rosa cried. "We don't know how to thank you," she said. "Don't," I told her, "just live." Well, watching them settle in was like watching the house exhale, like it had been holding its breath all those years under the Rivera's pride. Now, with toys scattered across the floor and music drifting through open windows, it felt alive again. And maybe, in some way, so did I. One afternoon, while I was helping Rosa fix the curtain rods, I found something in one of the storage rooms, a small, forgotten photo frame turned face down on a shelf. It was a picture of Marco and me from our wedding day. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it. We looked so young, hopeful, foolish, full of promise. I didn't feel bitterness anymore, just gratitude. Because if not for that pain, I might never have remembered who I was. That night, I took the photo home with me. I didn't hide it or throw it away. I placed it in a box with my grandmother's deed and a few letters she'd written before she passed. It felt right to keep them together, symbols of where I'd come from and what I'd overcome. A week later, Marco called. It had been months since we'd spoken. He sounded lighter somehow. "Mom wanted me to tell you thank you," he said. "For what?" "For the family you let stay in the house." She visited them, said it reminded her what home used to mean. I smiled softly, "Then maybe we both learned something." He hesitated. "You're different now." "I just remembered who I was," I said, "before all of this." He was quiet for a while. Then, before hanging up, he said, "You were always stronger than me." After he hung up, I sat quietly, the phone warm in my hand. I didn't cry, I didn't need to. Because healing doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it comes with a quiet acceptance, the kind that feels like standing barefoot on familiar ground. That night, I wrote a letter to my grandmother, not to send, of course, but to release. "Lola," I wrote, "I used to think strength meant staying quiet, but now I know it also means knowing when to speak, when to stand, and when to walk away. The land you left me became my voice, and it spoke for me when I couldn't." I folded the letter neatly, placed it in the box with the photo and the deed, and whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time in a long, long while, the silence answered back with peace. There's something sacred about finding rhythm again. For so long, my life had been built around other people's noise, what they wanted, what they said about me, how they measured success. Now the days passed quietly, steady as breathing. The community center asked me to take on a new role, helping organize programs for women starting over. I said yes. It felt right. Every morning I'd unlock the doors, turn on the lights, and hear the faint echo of laughter from the daycare next door. The scent of chalk and soap filled the air. Life, simple, unglamorous, ordinary, was happening all around me. Sometimes the women would come in carrying the same kind of hurt I once carried. One afternoon, a young wife named B sat across from me, twisting her hands. Her husband's family had been belittling her for years. "They make me feel like I'm nothing," she said. I smiled, slow and steady. "Then build something of your own," I told her. "It doesn't have to be big, it just has to be yours." When she left, she hugged me so tightly I could feel her trembling. I realized then that maybe that was what the whole journey had been for, not revenge, not justice, but understanding. So I could turn my scars into something softer for someone else to lean on. One Sunday morning, I walked past the Laurel Street house again. Rosa was outside watering plants while little Tomas chased a paper airplane down the driveway. The air smelled of jasmine. They waved when they saw me. "Come in, Miss Selina," Rosa called. "We're making adobo." I laughed. "You learn from the best," I teased. Inside, the house felt lighter than it ever had before. The walls weren't whispering anymore. They were listening to music, to laughter, to life. Rosa handed me a wooden spoon and said, "Taste this, tell me if it needs salt." It was perfect. I thought about how different it felt to stand in that kitchen again, not as a guest, not as someone being measured, but as someone who'd given it new life. The marble counters, the same ones Mrs. Rivera once polished like trophies, now had little handprints from Tomas's sticky fingers. The chandelier above still shimmered, but now it reflected joy instead of pride. And I realized this was the house's healing too. Later that afternoon, as I was leaving, I saw Mrs. Rivera across the street. She was walking slowly, arm in arm with Marco. They saw me and paused. For a moment, we just stood there, sunlight falling gently between us. Then she nodded, just a small gesture but full of meaning. Respect, maybe even gratitude. I nodded back. Marco raised a hand in greeting, the corners of his mouth twitching into something that almost looked like peace. Then they turned and continued down the street, moving at a pace that matched the new rhythm of life, slow, humble, human. That evening, back in my apartment, I stood by the window again, tea in hand. The city lights shimmered below, soft and warm. I thought about everything, the cruelty, the laughter, the long silence that became my strength. Pain, I realized, doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it distills. It clarifies who you are, what you can bear, and what truly matters. I picked up the box from the shelf. My grandmother's letters, the deed, the old photo. I didn't need to keep them hidden anymore. I placed them on the table, open. They weren't reminders of loss now, they were proof of survival. As the candle burned low, I whispered to the empty room, "Thank you for every no that led me back to yes." Outside, a light breeze rustled the curtains. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. And in that sound, I heard the closing of one story and the gentle beginning of another. Sometimes I still drive down Laurel Street at dusk. The sun settles low and golden behind the houses, washing everything in that soft light that makes even old wounds look gentle. When I pass the gate, the one that used to shut me out, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel gratitude, not for what happened, but for what it taught me. You see, life has a way of giving us classrooms in the strangest forms: a cold dinner table, a cruel laugh, a silence that stretches too long. The Riveras were my classroom. Marco was my lesson, and I suppose the woman I became, that was the homework I finally finished. People sometimes ask if I ever regretted buying that house, if it was revenge or pride or something darker. The truth is simpler: it was closure. It was taking back the space where my worth was questioned and planting peace there instead. When I look at that home now, I don't see marble floors or chandeliers. I see Rose's laughter from the kitchen window, Tomas running barefoot on the lawn, the sound of real joy living where pretense used to breathe. It reminds me that healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about transforming it into something kinder. And as for Marco's family, well, they learned too. Pride doesn't feed you when your table is empty of love. Mrs. Rivera still sends flowers sometimes, always white lilies, always with a small note that says, "Thank you for reminding us what home means." I keep those notes in the same box with my grandmother's letters, because in some quiet way, it feels like the story came full circle. The land she left me gave life back to a house that once took mine. Now, when women come into the community center, frightened and small, I tell them, don't rush your revenge, wait for your peace. Because peace lasts longer, it looks better on you, and it never needs explaining. So, my dear listener, if someone ever makes you feel small for what you don't have, remember, the soil beneath your feet might be richer than all their marble floors. Have you ever found strength in silence? Let time and truth speak for you when you could. Tell me in the comments below, and if my story found a home somewhere in your heart tonight, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes, we all need a reminder that quiet women are not weak. They're just waiting for the right moment to speak.